The Debt of Silence. Section 1. The Weight of an Empty Pocket. The invitation sat on the granite countertop, its gold-embossed edges mocking the chipped laminate of the life I had lived for 7 years. It was a gala for the city's elite, the kind of event where the air smells of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of real power. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have even been allowed to park the cars at an event like this. Today, my name was on the donor list, though tucked behind a series of holding companies and anonymous trusts that kept my true identity buried under layers of legal shielding. I looked at my hands, still scarred with the faint, faded lines of manual labor from the years I spent working 3 jobs to keep Sarah's dreams of a luxury lifestyle alive. She never knew about the trust fund. My father, a man who believed that character was forged in the fires of struggle, had locked my inheritance behind a 30-year vault. I was to receive nothing until I turned 35, or until I proved I could build a life from nothing. He wanted me to be loved for who I was, not what I possessed. He died before he could see that his experiment had failed, or perhaps in his own cynical way it had worked perfectly. It had shown me exactly who Sarah was. I remember the night she left. The apartment was cold because the heater had broken again, and I didn't have the $80 for the repairman. She didn't scream. She didn't throw plates. That would have required an emotional investment she no longer possessed. Instead, she just stood there, draped in a coat that cost more than my monthly take-home pay gift, she said, from a friend at work. She looked at the peeling wallpaper and then at me. Her eyes filled with a clinical kind of disgust. "I'm tired of being a character in a tragedy, Elias," she told me. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth that used to make the long shifts bearable. "You're a good man, but a good man isn't enough to pay for the life I deserve. I'm 30, and I'm still taking the bus. I'm done waiting for a ship that's never coming in." I had tried to tell her then. I had reached for her hand, ready to explain that in just a few months the clock would run out on the trust. I wanted to tell her that the poverty was a test, a temporary shadow. But the way she pulled her hand away, as if my touch were a contagion, silenced me. If she couldn't stay for the man who worked 12 hours a day to buy her jewelry, she didn't deserve the man who owned the jewelry store. I stayed silent. I watched her pack. I watched her walk out the door and into the passenger seat of a sleek, black European sedan that had been idling at the curb for 20 minutes. I didn't chase her. I sat in the dark, listening to the silence of a home that had never truly been mine because it was built on a foundation of her dissatisfaction. That was the moment I understood that love, for some, is a commodity with a fluctuating market price. I was trading at an all-time low, and she was divesting. In the 5 years since, I have moved through the world like a ghost. When the inheritance hit, I didn't buy a mansion in the hills or a fleet of supercars. I bought back my time. I bought the companies that had once ignored my resumes. I bought the debt of the men who had looked down on me. I realized that the greatest power isn't in showing people what you have. It's in letting them believe you have nothing while you hold their future in your hands. The gala was a calculated risk. I knew she would be there. Her new husband, Julian, was a man who lived on the surface of things, a real estate developer whose portfolio was held together by high-interest loans and a desperate need for public validation. He was exactly the kind of man Sarah wanted, loud, visible, and ostensibly wealthy. But I had spent the last 6 months quietly purchasing the primary notes on Julian's latest development project. He thought he was dealing with a faceless conglomerate based in Singapore. He had no idea he was dealing with the man whose wife he had taken. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I didn't want a scene. I simply wanted to observe the architecture of their betrayal from the vantage point of my new reality. As I fastened my cufflinks, simple, silver, no diamonds, I felt a strange sense of equilibrium. The scales were finally balancing, but not through anger. They were balancing through the cold, hard logic of consequence. I stepped out of my modest apartment, a choice, not a necessity, and signaled for the car. Not a limousine, but a discreet black sedan that blended into the evening shadows. The driver didn't speak. He knew the destination. I sat in the back, watching the city lights blur, wondering if Sarah still looked at the world with that same clinical disgust, or if she had finally found the life she deserved. I suspected she was realizing that the price of admission was much higher than she had anticipated. Section 2. The Architecture of an Illusion. The ballroom was a sea of orchestrated elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the ceiling, casting a sharp, unforgiving light on the faces of the city's power brokers. I moved through the crowd with a practiced anonymity. It is a peculiar thing to be the wealthiest person in a room while being treated as an intruder. People looked through me, their eyes sliding past my off-the-rack suit to find someone with more status. I found a quiet corner near the balcony, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Sarah appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her hand draped over Julian's arm. She looked radiant, or rather, she looked expensive. The dress was a deep emerald silk that caught the light with every choreographed step. She moved with a practiced grace, a woman who had finally stepped into the role she had been rehearsing for her entire life. Julian was beside her, his chest puffed out, nodding to men who barely acknowledged him. He was a man who mistook proximity to wealth for wealth itself. I stayed silent because I wanted to see the cracks. It took less than an hour. From my vantage point, I saw the way Julian's smile faltered when he leaned in to speak to a senior partner at the firm I had quietly acquired last month. I saw the way Sarah's eyes darted around the room, constantly measuring herself against the other women, checking for a more expensive necklace or a more prestigious table. They weren't happy, they were performing. They were in a constant state of social combat, terrified of losing the ground they had gained. When they finally moved toward the bar near my corner, I didn't turn away. I stood my ground. I wanted to see the moment the past collided with the present. Sarah saw me first. Her glass tilted slightly, a small tremor of recognition crossing her face before she masked it with a look of profound pity. She whispered something to Julian, who let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. They approached me not out of kindness, but to reinforce the hierarchy they believed was still in place. "Elias," Sarah said, her voice sounding like a memory I had purposely muffled, "I didn't expect to see you here. Are you working the event?" The insult was effortless, delivered with a soft smile that didn't reach her eyes. She genuinely couldn't conceive of a world where I belonged in this room as a guest. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the silence stretch just a second too long. It's a technique I've learned in boardrooms. Silence forces the other person to fill the void, and they usually fill it with their own insecurities. "I'm a guest, Sarah," I said simply. My voice was calm, devoid of the hurt she was clearly fishing for. Julian stepped forward, his hand sliding into his pocket in a gesture of unearned dominance. "A guest? Really? I didn't know the local library had a seat at the table tonight. Good for you, man. It's important to see how the other half lives, right? Maybe it'll inspire you to finally do something with your life." He patted my shoulder, a condescending gesture that felt like a brand. I didn't flinch. I just looked at his hand until he felt uncomfortable enough to remove it. "I find the view from here very illuminating, Julian," I replied. "You'd be surprised what you can see when you aren't busy trying to be seen." Sarah's brow furrowed. She was looking for the man who used to beg for her approval, the man who would have been devastated by their mockery. Instead, she found someone she didn't recognize, someone who looked at her with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. "We heard about your situation," Sarah said, her tone shifting to a patronizing faux sympathy. "The apartment, the jobs." It must be hard. Julian and I were actually talking about setting up a foundation for people who just can't seem to get ahead. Maybe there's a place for you there. She was trying to provoke me, to force a reaction that would justify her decision to leave. If I was angry, she was right. If I was bitter, she was the victor. But I felt nothing but a strange, hollowed-out clarity. I realized that she wasn't just cruel, she was small. She was a person who defined her worth by the poverty of others. "That's very generous of you," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the quiet, steady tone of a man who knows exactly how much the person in front of him owes. "But I think Julian has enough on his plate right now. The Riverside project is quite an undertaking. I hear the financing is delicate." Julian's face went pale, the ruddy color of the wine he was drinking draining away in an instant. That project was his great work, the one he had leveraged everything to build. He hadn't gone public with the funding issues yet. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing in a mix of confusion and sudden sharp fear. "How do you know about Riverside?" he demanded, his voice losing its polished edge. I didn't answer him directly. I just turned my gaze to Sarah, who was watching her husband's reaction with growing unease. The seeds of doubt were planted. The silent power shift had begun, not through a grand reveal, but through a single informed sentence. As they walked away, Julian's step was no longer confident, and Sarah's hand was no longer resting lightly on his arm. She was gripping him, as if sensing the ground beneath them was no longer solid. I watched them disappear into the crowd, knowing that tomorrow the first of the margin calls would arrive. The question wasn't if they would fall, but how long they would try to pretend they were still flying. Section 3. The Slow Decay of Certainty. The morning after the gala, the city looked different, sharper, less forgiving. I sat in my office on the 42nd floor of the building Julian had once tried to lease space in. From here, the people below looked like ants, scurrying with a sense of urgency that I had finally outrun. My desk was clear, save for a single manila folder containing the forensic audit of Julian's primary holding company, Apex Development. I stayed silent because the numbers spoke with a roar that no shouting could match. He was over-leveraged by a factor of 10. He had been using new investor capital to pay off old interest, a classic spiral that worked only as long as the market remained blind. But I was no longer blind. I was the one holding the lens. I realized that Julian wasn't a villain in the grand sense. He was a gambler who had mistaken a winning streak for talent. And Sarah? Sarah was the prize he had bought to prove he had won. I looked at the photograph attached to the file, a surveillance shot of the two of them leaving a high-end jewelry store 3 days ago. Sarah was laughing, a new diamond tennis bracelet catching the sun. That bracelet had been paid for with money that technically belonged to my subsidiary. It was a strange feeling, providing for my ex-wife's luxury through the impending ruin of her husband. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt a cold, clinical weight in my chest. This was the natural law of the world. Those who build on sand cannot complain when the tide comes in. The phone rang. It was my head of acquisitions, a man who moved with the same quiet lethality I had cultivated. "He's calling for an emergency meeting with the creditors," he said. "He knows the Singapore group bought the debt. He's panicking. He's offering more collateral." I leaned back in my chair, watching a hawk circle the skyscrapers outside. "Let him wait," I replied. "Tell him the board is reviewing the proposal. Give him 48 hours of silence. In the world of high-stakes finance, silence is a vacuum. It sucks the oxygen out of a room. Julian would spend those 48 hours explaining to Sarah why the credit cards were being declined at dinner. He would have to look into the eyes of the woman who married him for his stability and tell her that the foundation was cracking. That was the moment I understood that the truest consequences are the ones people have to live with behind closed doors. Pressure must increase, never stabilize. I directed my team to begin the soft foreclosure process on his secondary properties, the vacation homes, the fleet of cars. Not a seizure, just a notification of intent. I wanted the notices to arrive while they were home. I wanted the reality of their situation to bleed into their morning coffee and their evening wine. I stayed in my office until late, not out of necessity, but because I found peace in the stillness. I thought about the man I was 5 years ago, the one who cried in a cold apartment because he couldn't provide a luxury lifestyle. That man was dead, buried under the weight of $500 million, and the realization that Sarah's love had a price tag I was finally overqualified to pay. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was just 3 words, "We need help." I didn't respond. I simply set the phone face down on the mahogany desk and walked out into the cool evening air. Section 4. The Fragility of the Pedestal. 3 days later, I was sitting in a nondescript cafe 3 blocks away from Julian's headquarters. I wasn't hiding, I was observing. I saw them emerge from the glass doors, Sarah and Julian. The transformation was subtle, but telling. Sarah's emerald silk was gone, replaced by a sharp business suit that looked a season too old. Her hair wasn't as perfectly coiffed, and the way she walked, faster, more erratic, betrayed a nervous energy she couldn't hide. Julian looked worse. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and he was staring at his phone as if it were a ticking bomb. They were arguing. Not a loud public spat, but the sharp hissed whispers of a couple whose shared myth was dissolving. I realized that their entire relationship was built on the premise of more. Without the more, there was no them. I stayed silent as they scanned the street, Julian's eyes stopping on my black sedan parked at the curb. He didn't know it was mine, but he recognized the aura of it. The quiet, expensive authority of someone who wasn't worried about the next hour. I watched Sarah touch his arm, a gesture that looked less like support and more like a demand for a solution he didn't have. That was the moment I understood the brilliance of my father's plan. He hadn't just been testing me, he had been protecting me. He knew that a man with $500 million attracts many things, but a man with nothing attracts only what is real. I decided it was time for the next fragment of the reveal. I sent a courier to their home address. It wasn't a legal document or a threat. It was a simple handwritten note on heavy cream stationery. It said, "The view from the library is much clearer than you imagined. Dinner at 8?" I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. The psychological pressure of an anonymous benefactor or an anonymous executioner is far greater than a known enemy. I knew that Sarah would recognize the handwriting, or at least the cadence of the words. I wanted them to spend the afternoon wondering how the poor man they had mocked at the gala held the keys to their kingdom. As I walked back to my car, I felt the social imbalance shift physically, like a change in air pressure. I was no longer the ghost of their past. I was the architect of their immediate future. I drove to the restaurant I had booked, a place so exclusive it didn't have a sign on the door, only a small brass plaque. I sat at the center table, the only one occupied in the entire room. I had bought the night's reservations for the entire establishment just to ensure our privacy. When the doors opened at 8005, I didn't look up from my menu. I listened to the sound of their footsteps. Julian's heavy, desperate stride and Sarah's hesitant, clicking heels. They stopped at the edge of the table. I looked up, smiled a greeting that didn't reach my eyes, and gestured to the empty chairs. "Please," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "I've already ordered the wine. It's a 1945 Lafite, a vintage that understands the value of waiting." Julian collapsed into the chair, but Sarah remained standing, her eyes boring into mine with a mixture of horror and a dawning, terrible realization. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what have you done?" I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the silence hang until the tension in the room was a physical cord ready to snap. "I didn't do anything, Sarah," I replied quietly. "I simply stopped pretending." Section 5. The Anatomy of a Collapse. The restaurant was a tomb of high-end finishes and suffocating silence. Julian sat across from me, his hands trembling so violently he had to hook them under the table. Sarah finally sank into her chair, her gaze fixed on the wineglass as if it were an oracle. She looked at me, her eyes searching for a trace of the man who used to look at her with adoration. She found a stranger. I realized that the hardest part of this transition wasn't gaining the wealth. It was the psychological shedding of the need to be understood by her. I stayed silent because I wanted her to feel the weight of the void. Every second that passed was a second she spent recalculating 5 years of her life. "You've been the one," Julian finally croaked, his voice cracking. "The Singapore Holding Company, the foreclosure notices, the Riverside debt. It was you the whole time." He wasn't asking, he was mourning. His world had been dismantled by someone he considered a footnote in his wife's history. I leaned back, the leather of the chair creaking softly. That was the moment I understood that true power isn't about the ability to destroy, it's about the ability to choose not to. I could have wiped them out in a week. Instead, I had let them walk into their own trap. "I'm just a businessman, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "I look for undervalued assets with poor management. You were the definition of a liability. I simply bought the debt you were too arrogant to manage." I saw Sarah's expression shift from shock to a cold, calculating desperation. She reached across the table, her fingers grazing my sleeve, a touch that would have sent a jolt through me 5 years ago. Now it felt like a mosquito landing on a marble statue. "Elias," she whispered, her voice regaining that melodic, manipulative quality I once loved. "I didn't know." "If I had known what you were going through, the burden you were carrying, I would have never left. I was scared, Elias. I thought we were drowning." It was a masterpiece of a lie, delivered with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her life trading on her charm. She wasn't apologizing for leaving. She was apologizing for leaving too early. The psychological pressure in the room shifted. Julian looked at his wife, then at me, the realization dawning on him that he was being traded in real time. He was the failing asset, and she was looking for a bailout. "You're actually doing this?" Julian hissed at her, his desperation turning into a sharp, bitter bile. "You're going to sit here and rewrite history while I'm losing everything?" Sarah didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained locked on mine, searching for a spark of the old Elias. I watched her, marveling at the sheer efficiency of her betrayal. She was ready to discard him just as she had discarded me, with the same clinical efficiency. I realized then that my father's test hadn't just revealed her character, it had revealed her nature. She was a survivor of the most shallow kind. I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the flavors of oak and thyme settle on my tongue. "You didn't leave because we were drowning, Sarah," I said, my voice devoid of anger. "We weren't even in the water. You left because you didn't like the view from the shore. You wanted the yacht, and you didn't care whose blood was used for the fuel." The silence returned, thicker than before. Julian put his head in his hands, a broken man in an expensive suit. Sarah's hand retracted from my sleeve, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated coldness. She knew the game was over. The bridge wasn't just burned, the island had moved. "So what now?" she asked, her voice flat. "Are you going to enjoy watching us lose the house, the cars, everything?" I looked at her, then at the check the waiter had quietly placed on the table. "I'm not going to watch it all," I replied. "I have much more important things to attend to." I stood up, leaving a stack of bills that covered the wine and the empty reservations. As I turned to leave, I saw Julian look up, his eyes bloodshot. "Why?" he asked. "Why go to all this trouble?" I paused, looking back at them. A portrait of a marriage built on a lie. "Because," I said softly, "I wanted to see if the life you deserved was worth the price you paid for it." I walked out, leaving the question hanging in the air like a sentence. Session 6. The Quiet Displacement. The following weeks were a masterclass in silent displacement. I didn't need to file lawsuits or hold press conferences. The momentum of Julian's own greed did the work for me. As the lead creditor, I simply stopped granting extensions. I stayed silent while his office was packed into boxes and his exclusive developments were rebranded under my parent company's logo. I realized that the most profound shifts in power are the ones that happen in the shadows, where the public only sees the result, never the process. Every time I saw a headline about the sudden collapse of Apex Development, I felt a quiet, grounded sense of closure. It wasn't joy. It was the feeling of a debt finally marked paid. I moved my primary operations into the penthouse suite of the very building Julian had dreamed of owning. From here, the city looked different, not like a playground, but like a responsibility. One afternoon, my assistant informed me that a woman was in the lobby, refusing to leave until she spoke with me. I didn't need to ask who it was. I realized that Sarah was entering the final stage of her cycle, the plea for a dignified exit. I stayed silent for a long moment, considering whether to even acknowledge her presence. But I knew that for the story to truly end, I had to see the final version of the woman I had once been willing to die for. She was waiting in the glass-walled reception area. Gone were the designer dresses and the emerald jewelry. She was wearing a simple trench coat, her face pale and drawn. She looked older, the lines of stress finally etching themselves into her skin. When she saw me, she didn't try to smile. She didn't try to touch me. She stood there, a person who had finally run out of moves. "The house is gone, Elias," she said, her voice hollow. "Julian left for Dubai last night. He took the last of the cash and left me with the subpoenas. I have nowhere to go." She was looking for a rescue, a final act of good man, mercy that would allow her to keep her head above water. I stayed silent because any word I offered would be a lifeline she didn't deserve. I looked at the city behind her, the sun reflecting off the glass towers I now controlled. "I remember a night 5 years ago," I said, my voice echoing in the minimalist space. "It was raining and the heater was broken. You told me you were tired of being a character in a tragedy." Sarah looked down, her shoulders slumped. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I didn't know who you were." I shook my head slowly. "No, Sarah, you knew exactly who I was. You just didn't know what I had. And in your world, that was the only thing that mattered. That was the moment I understood that her tragedy wasn't losing the money, it was the fact that she would never understand the value of anything else." I signaled to my assistant, who stepped forward with a small white envelope. Sarah's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. She probably thought it was a check, a parting gift to keep her in the lifestyle she felt she deserved. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was not a check, but a single bus ticket back to her hometown and a copy of the lease agreement for the apartment we had shared 5 years ago, the one with the peeling wallpaper and the broken heater. "I bought the building," I said quietly. "The rent is paid for 6 months. It's a place to start over, or a place to remember. The choice is yours." The look on her face was one of profound, crushing realization. It wasn't the cruelty of the gesture that broke her. It was the symmetry of it. I had given her exactly what she had left me with. I turned my back to her, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I heard the sound of the elevator doors opening, then closing. She was gone. The pressure had reached its peak, and now there was only the quiet, steady hum of a life reclaimed. I realized that the greatest power isn't in what you can take from someone, but in what you can return to them. Section 7. The Ghost of a Shared Life. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists at the top of a mountain or a corporate empire. I spent several hours looking at the lease agreement I had signed for the old apartment. It was a relic of a past life, a cramped two-bedroom unit on the edge of the industrial district. I stayed silent because the space between who I was then and who I am now felt like an ocean. I realized that my final act towards Sarah wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of brutal honesty. I had placed her back at the starting line, stripped of the unearned momentum she had stolen from Julian's temporary rise. The reports from the building manager came in 3 days later. Sarah had moved in. She hadn't taken the bus ticket, but she had taken the keys. My internal monologue was a steady drumbeat of observation. I realized that she had no other options. I stayed silent because my voice no longer needed to reach her. I found myself driving past the old neighborhood late one Tuesday evening. I stayed in the back of the car, the tinted windows shielding me from the world I had escaped. I saw her through the window of the second-floor unit. She was standing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I used to count coins for the electric bill. She was illuminated by the harsh, flickering light of an old fluorescent bulb. That was the moment I understood that the ghost of our marriage wasn't haunting the apartment. She was. Psychological pressure is a strange thing. When you have everything, you fear losing it. When you have nothing, you fear the memory of what you had. I could see the weight of the memory pressing down on her shoulders. She was moving slowly, her movements lacking the frantic grace she had displayed at the gala. She was a woman living in a museum of her own failure. I directed my driver to move on. I didn't need to see more. I had achieved the silent dominance I sought, not by towering over her, but by removing the ladder she used to climb. Every contract I signed, every acquisition I finalized over the next week, felt lighter. The debt of silence was being settled in installments. I received a final communication from Julian's legal team, or what was left of it. They were looking for a settlement, a way to avoid the criminal investigations into his creative accounting. I realized that Julian was still trying to negotiate with a world that had already moved on. I stayed silent. I didn't respond to the emails or the frantic voicemails. I simply allowed the legal system to grind forward with its cold, mechanical inevitability. The rising pressure on Julian was now out of my hands. It was the pressure of a collapsing star. As I sat in my penthouse, watching the rain streak against the glass, I realized that the narrative I had built, the story of my own return, was almost complete. The only thing left was the final clarity of the ending. Section 8. The Weight of the Crown. The final meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the city's courthouse. It wasn't a trial, it was a signature. Julian was being processed for a series of financial irregularities that would keep him in legal limbo for a decade. He looked like a shadow of a man, his expensive suit hanging off a frame that had lost 20 pounds in a month. He looked at me across the table, his eyes searching for an enemy. He didn't find one. He found a mirror. "You won," he said, his voice a dry rasp. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I stayed silent because winning implies there was a game. For me, this was simply the correction of a mistake. I realized that the moral victory I sought wasn't about their suffering. It was about my own liberation. I had spent 5 years fueled by the quiet energy of a man who had been discarded. Now, that fuel was gone, replaced by the steady, cold power of my own competence. I looked at the documents, the final transfer of Julian's remaining assets to the charitable trust I had established in my father's name. I was taking nothing for myself. The $500 million was a tool, not a prize. That was the moment I understood my father's true intent. He didn't want me to be rich. He wanted me to be untouchable. He wanted me to be a man who could lose everything and still be the most powerful person in the room. The final closure came not in the courtroom, but on the sidewalk outside. Sarah was waiting by the steps. She didn't approach me. She just stood there as I walked toward my car. The silence between us was final. It was a physical wall that no apology or explanation could breach. I realized that she was waiting for a sign of regret or a flicker of the old Elias. I gave her neither. I stopped for a moment, adjusted my coat, and looked at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long, dignified shadows across the city. I stayed silent because there was nothing left to say. The power shift was complete. It was now invisible, a permanent part of the landscape. I got into the car. The driver pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of the city. I looked out the window, watching the streetlights begin to glow. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a deep, rhythmic peace that had nothing to do with the numbers in my bank account. The architecture of the betrayal had been dismantled, and in its place, I had built something far more durable, a life defined by my own terms. I realized that the story was over not because I had achieved victory, but because I no longer needed the narrative to feel whole. I closed my eyes as the car moved into the dark, knowing that tomorrow the world would continue, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.